Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to use Craftworld Eldar Dire Avengers in 10th edition, and this is part 3 of my Aspect Warrior series. So I chose to do Dire Avengers today because they are one of the more popular units in our codex. However, they have had quite the change. They are no longer the Hail of Doom masters that they once were, but there is good news. These guys are still a phenomenal unit. They're still a great unit with a lot of firepower behind it and some crafty Eldar tricks. So let's go ahead and dive right into it and talk about Dire Avengers in 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be overviewing the stats, weapons, and special rules of the Dire Avengers. We're going to be looking at their strengths and their weaknesses, their combos and synergies, and the role Dire Avengers play in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. Starting with their stats, they have an average Eldar movement at 7 inches, which is good. It's just, nowhere compared to things like Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders. They have a 4+ save and a 5+ invulnerable save, which, again, is average stats for Eldar units, especially their Aspect Warriors. So they share similar durability to Howling Banshees and Swooping Hawks. And they have Objective Control 1, which makes them just okay at controlling objectives. For their ranged weapons, they have the Avengers Shuriken Catapult, which is a better Shuriken Catapult. It has one additional shot over the normal one, and it has lethal hits as well. So lethal hits basically means that every 6 to hit is granting you an auto wound, so it's kind of like the old Hail of Doom without the extra AP. It also has decent base AP at -1. A lot of, basic ranged weapons don't really have that. The Shuriken Catapults retained that AP, has damage 1, and you have the Shuriken Pistol, which you can give to the Exarch, which, of course, is an option you'll probably never take. For the unit's melee weapons, the actual unit has no melee weapon, which is obviously an oversight done by GW. GW rushed through a lot of these indexes, you can really tell, and a lot of our units actually don't have combat weapons, or if they do, the special weapons, like on the Storm Guardians, seem to replace them, which means, rules as written, a lot of our units are not getting attacks in close combat. Now, there is a little bit of an argument here as to what you should use in your games. Here's my advice, and here's what I've been doing. A lot of codexes out there have a similar problem. It's not just us. So, if you agree with your opponent before the game that all your units that don't have close combat weapons have a close combat weapon, and you can share it with a similar profile in your codex, like Guardian Defenders have a close combat weapon, then everything is good. So what I've done is I've actually just told my opponents, I'm going to use the Swooping Hawk combat profile because the Swooping Hawks just have a regular close combat weapon, and these guys probably should have the same thing. And all of my opponents in my group have agreed, and we've done a similar thing with their units as well. So if you're worried about that, it is something you can talk to your opponent about beforehand, unless you're running like a really competitive tournament or something. And even then, if you ask the tournament organizers about it, they'll probably be pretty cool about it and say, yeah, they just have close combat weapons. That's fine, right? So the Exarch, however, can take melee weapons, but both the Dire Sword and Power Glaive are pretty inferior to the additional Shuriken Catapult that you would normally get. The Dire Sword just has devastating wounds and is a power weapon. Big deal. The Power Glaive has 1 additional strength. So both of them are pretty lame, in my opinion. So you're better off going with the dual Avenger Shuriken Catapults. As far as their abilities go, they overwatch on a 5+ normally or 4+ when in range of an objective you control. Do keep in mind that even though you need to control it, that entire Dire Avenger unit does not have to be in range of said objective. You can have a couple models in range of the objective and still be able to overwatch on a 4+ because of how the rule is written. It basically just says if this unit is in range of an objective you control, and it doesn't say completely within. So because it doesn't say that, you can definitely, just have a couple of Dire Avengers in there and your whole unit can shoot on a 4+. As far as the wargear options, of course, the Dire Avenger Exarch can be armed with the Dire Sword, Power Glaive, or Shimmer Shield. If you don't choose to go with those options, you can go with dual Shuriken Catapults, which is the obvious choice in most situations because you're going to want to maximize that overwatch and their ranged damage. The Shimmer Shield does give you a 4+ invulnerable save, but you're rarely going to use this thing anyway, so there's not really a point. As far as their unit composition, they can be taken in units of 5 or 10, 70 points for 5, and 140 for 10, which is fairly cost effective for the damage they can put out in ideal situations. But these are by no means a cheap unit. They're actually more expensive than they were last edition, so you do have to be a little bit careful when using them effectively. As for their keywords, they are infantry, and they have the grenades keyword, which is pretty cool. It means they can benefit from the grenade stratagem and deal a few mortal wounds to an enemy unit if they're within 8 inches. Okay, so what are the Dire Avengers' strengths and weaknesses? So their biggest strength is that they have really powerful anti-infantry range damage. They have AP -1, which is phenomenal on an anti-infantry unit. Again, most infantry units that are, basic troops don't have AP on their guns. Bolt guns got that taken away. They have AP 0. Flesh borers and things like that don't really have AP either, to my best knowledge anyway. And most guns in the game have had their AP stripped. So what that means is Dire Avengers are in a pretty good position for dealing with more heavily armored targets. They have really efficient Overwatch that hits on a 4+ when in range of an objective you control, 5+ otherwise, which is still good. 5+ is decent. You're going to want 4+, but if you can't get it, 5+ is still a decent Overwatch opportunity. So these guys can threaten enemy units in both your turn and the opponent's turn. Their weaknesses are they're fragile and relatively slow. Their speed's 7, so on average, unless you advance forward and get a good advance roll, they're not going to be able to get to an objective turn 1. And again, you could easily use a fate dice or spend a command point to do that, but it is a little bit more resource intensive and other units can just fly, right? Like, for example, Warp Spiders can move 24 inches and Swooping Hawks can move 14 inches base plus an advance roll of d6. So both of those units are faster than the Dire Avengers. Swooping Hawks are about the same cost. So these guys are a bit on the slower side compared to other units in their anti-infantry role. And on top of that, they are objective and Overwatch dependent. So anything that messes with that will hamstring them considerably. So basically, if something gets to an objective first and prevents you from controlling it, or messes with your Overwatch in any way, and that can be something like making it cost more command points or anything like that, your Dire Avengers are going to be at a considerable disadvantage and will be considerably hamstrung. So do watch out for that. Those things can throw a wrench in your plans. As far as their combos and synergies go, Azurman gives them amazing value with free and additional Overwatch. So 2 units of Dire Avengers can both Overwatch on a 4+ with Azurman. It's a really good combo that I've used a couple times. Basically, it involves taking 2 units of full Dire Avengers in Wave Serpents with Azurman, moving up onto an objective, 2 objectives that is, in No Man's Land, shooting at enemy units, and then basically just sitting there and waiting for Overwatch. Which you can do twice with Azurman, and it'll only cost 1 command point for the unit that Azurman is not part of. Rangers and Striking Scorpions can infiltrate to ensure they get to the midfield objective. So a lot of the times your opponent, if he sees something like this, will just move their infiltrators onto the objectives and say, oh, well, guess you can't do it, right? Because you're not going to be in control of the objective. So they can screen you out, essentially. So Rangers and Striking Scorpions can get into positions before the start of the game to ensure that your Dire Avengers will be able to get onto an objective safely. At least one of the units. Guide is also a great buff, and it lasts 1 whole round, so it affects both shooting and Overwatch. So if you're Overwatching on a 4+ with Guide, you're re-rolling those hits in your opponent's turn. Very strong. Vipers are also very good at stripping cover from enemies. Usually Dire Avengers are going to want to shoot things that are going to be benefiting from cover. So having a Viper can reduce the survivability of said unit considerably. Vipers are basically, in my opinion, one of the auto-includes for utility in an Eldar list. At least having one of them in your list is very strong. So Vipers pair really well with Dire Avengers as well for clearing out infantry targets. Also, Bladestorm. Bladestorm is a pretty effective stratagem to use on Dire Avengers. It's not the most effective. I think Shroud Runners and Wind Riders with Scatter Lasers are much better targets in general, especially if you run big units with Guide. But let's be real for a second. You're not always going to have these units in your army. You might just have Dire Avengers. So Blade Storm is a good alternative stratagem to use on them. Even though it doesn't synergize with lethal hits, you're typically going to have so many attacks that you're going to get a lot more than just lethal hits. So on the rest of those attacks, you will be getting the chance to get an additional -2 AP on your weapons, which is really strong. Again, that's AP -3. That harkens back to basically what they could do last edition, and that's very good. So if you really need to get rid of a unit and you're a couple damage points off, maybe 2 or 3 wounds off of it, consider Blade Storm for a way to clear those infantry out. Okay, so what is the role of Dire Avengers in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them? So Dire Avengers, first and foremost, are an anti-infantry area denial unit that between strong shooting and Overwatch on a 4+, can set up a lot of situations where enemy infantry entering their range just get blown away. And of course, the heavier infantry like Terminators and stuff like that will survive in Overwatch, but at considerable cost. Especially if you have the unit guided and things like that, it's going to be really pricey for anything to move within 18 inches of that unit of Dire Avengers, which is really cool. It's actually really cool to have a unit like this because it controls the board so well, and your opponent is going to be hard-pressed to essentially eat that Overwatch, right? No one likes to eat an Overwatch, especially if it's done with hitting on a 4+. And because of this, large units of 10 are a lot more efficient with Overwatch and is the optimal way to run them. I know some people might argue that a unit of 5 is still good, and it can be. You could drop them out of a Falcon, they could reroll wounds and things like that, but you're not getting the most out of their ability. And I think that units of 10 in general are the way to go with these guys. And I would actually put out the argument that if you're just using a unit of 5, you might as well use Swooping Hawks or you might as well use Shroud Runners because those are around the same cost as the Dire Avengers and they do much more for you at that specific price point. So run them in units of 10 for sure because you're going to be able to maximize your Overwatch damage as a result. These guys are also really good when paired with a Wave Serpent. It allows them to get on objectives much quicker and set up. The Wave Serpent can then protect them from close combat. And also, the Serpent Shield is good at essentially doing a couple of extra mortal wounds and also battle shocking enemies. So if a unit comes up to you, you overwatch them, and right before, you overwatch, if they move within 12 inches, which they will do if they plan to assault the Dire Avengers and take the objective away. Again, Dire Avengers are just not good in combat, so a lot of units will be looking to get into close combat with them. Using a Wave Serpent's Serpent Shield ability can stop them from using a command point to reroll the charge roll, can stop them from using any stratagems that might boost their combat range or charge range, or even toughness, so your Overwatch will be able to hit through even better. And there's a lot of reactive stratagems out there now that boost toughness against shooting and things like this. Even in the core rulebook, there's things like take cover. So, obviously, if you don't want to give your opponent a cover save or anything like that, or a -1 to hit, the Wave Serpent can definitely help sometimes with this. It's definitely not a guarantee because the Wave Serpent just forces a Battle Shock test and not an actual Battle Shock. So they could just pass the Battle Shock test, but it is a chance that you will be reducing that damage done. Alternatively, you could also put them in reserve and then use Fire and Fade to move them onto an objective where they can overwatch. That's another option. It's harder to pull off. Your opponent could easily screen it out, but in the later turns of the game, turn 3, maybe turn 4 if there's no openings, moving them onto the board, shooting an enemy off an objective in the backfield, and then Fire and Fading onto an objective could be a very good strategy to use. And again, if your opponent leaves it open, take it, because 10 Dire Avengers on, an enemy objective in their deployment zone is something that they're not going to be able to easily remove. And it's actually something I did myself and had some success with it. I was running against my Imperial Guard buddy. He had a big blob of 20 guardsmen on an objective in the backfield, just sitting there, an infantry squad, had some heavy weapons in and so forth. And I pretty much knew that I wasn't going to be able to get both of my Dire Avenger squads onto objectives in the middle of the board. So I used one of the units, put it in reserve, and kept it there until turn 4, until most of his army was battling in the midfield. And then I snuck behind him, shot his guardsman right off the objective, and then fire and faded right onto it. And yes, you can use fire and fade after coming from reserve. There is absolutely no restriction from you doing that. As long as you arrive more than 9 inches away from an enemy unit, you can easily fire and fade then afterward. And then if you do have the command points for it, you can always phantasm as well in the opponent's movement phase. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with Dire Avengers if you hold them in reserve, but you just have to kind of wrap your head around the fact that they're not going to be available during the first few turns of the game, and they're not really going to be an area denial unit for that early section of the game. But again, if you do move them onto an objective in turn 3, or perhaps even turn 4, they can definitely deny a large area then, which is still insanely powerful. And it was really good against my opponent, who now, was basically out of position to deal with the Dire Avengers, and also allowed me to score a lot on behind enemy lines and deploy teleport homers and things like that. So it is a good strategy to use if your opponent is not aware of it. Okay, so in conclusion, Dire Avengers are looking pretty good this edition, and their area denial role really fits with their fluff as well. And of course, this is my opinion. I'm not like a master of lore or anything like that, but it seems to me like Dire Avengers are supposed to be fierce on the offense with shooting and stalwart in the defense, and of course, their defense is Overwatch, so that makes a lot of sense. Yes, they're not good in close combat, they never will be, but defensively, Overwatch is thematically good for them. It makes sense as a more defensive unit that can also be fierce on the offense. Anyway, they're especially deadly also with the Zerman and work well when paired with a Wave Serpent that can quickly drop them on objectives. So this is how I like to run them. I like to run them in the Wave Serpent. I think it's the best way to do it. There are other ways you can run them, like I mentioned before, from reserves and things like that, but I think the Wave Serpent just gives the most versatility. Because at the end of the day, you can always put a Wave Serpent into reserve as well with the Dire Avengers, and they can come out together. And yes, if you come out from reserves with the Wave Serpent, you can drop your unit of Dire Avengers off afterward. You just cannot assault. So the Wave Serpent counts as having moved. At the end of the movement phase is basically where you can drop your Dire Avengers off, and I believe you can come out of reserve, drop off your Dire Avengers, and everything will be fine. So that's another powerful option as well for taking backfield objectives or just being able to appear where your enemy least expects it. A Zerman, by the way, is a great Phoenix Lord also. He has a 3+ invulnerable save, so he's pretty hard to take down. He has great melee capabilities with devastating wounds, which is awesome. So kind of makes up for the fact that Dire Avengers are terrible in melee. And he can reduce the overall command point cost of Overwatch throughout the game. So yeah, I'm actually really happy with the way Dire Avengers were written this edition. I think they have a great role that fits perfectly with their lore, and it fits perfectly with certain play styles that the Eldar like to engage with. Area denial is something that Eldar are very good at, and Dire Avengers epitomize this role perfectly. And if you pair this with other area denial units like support weapon D cannons, you're going to give your opponent a lot to think about. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help has been greatly appreciated in making the channel better. If you do want to support the channel, I will leave the links in the description for you guys so that you can find them. And if you do become a supporter, a Patreon member, or YouTube member, you will get access to our Discord server where we're talking about Eldar pretty much every day. Whether it be hobbying, list building, or strategy, we're pretty helpful over there in the community, and you can always ask me any questions if you have them. Of course, you can have a free trial version of Patreon and basically still get access to the Discord server, and that access never runs out. So if you want to try it out, we'd be more than happy to add you to the community. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Peace out, and see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.